Hi. The present video is related to the book Indian Constitution at Work. The first and the foremost topic in the book is Constitution, Why and How. This chapter is going to be about the making of the Indian Constitution and the assessment of its legitimacy. To start with, I will be telling you about the meaning of the Constitution. Followed by that, we'll look into the need for Constitution, which will focus upon the functions of the Constitution in a generalized manner. Later on, we will try to assess how a general Constitution can be taken as a valid or legitimate document, keeping in mind certain important provisions which should go in the making of a good Constitution. Having understood the generalized approach in the making of the Constitution, we will take it forward with reference to the Indian Constitution. But to understand the Indian Constitution and its making, first and foremost, our approach has to be related to the timeline or the historical context. The important dates which went into the making of the Constitution will be highlighted. Later on, we will understand the important provisions which are related to making of a good legitimate document. In context of India, we will try to look into those important principles which we have dealt under a generalized approach. Our focus will be on three important principles: mode of promulgation, whether Indian Constitution was actually a democratic constitution or not. Later on, the focus will shift to substantive provisions, and lastly, we'll look into the balanced institutional design. If we are able to satisfy all these three conditions, we can safely come to the conclusion, yes, Indian Constitution is a legitimate document. Now, before I start, please note that I have split the chapter into three videos. This video would cover up the general principles of a constitution, starting with the definition, while in the next two videos, I would be discussing these principles with reference to the Indian Constitution. So, let us start with the meaning of a constitution. What is a constitution? Constitution is a fundamental set of principles that specifies how a state is to be governed. When we talk about how a state is to be governed, the Constitution clearly demarcates the authority of the state, giving the power to the government demarcated by legislative, executive and judicial authority. So there is division of powers clearly stated in a constitution to govern the country. The Constitution is fundamental in the nature because the laws or the principles enshrined in the Constitution are original in nature. The other laws which are made by the Parliament in the day-to-day working derive their authority from the Constitution itself. Thus, the ordinary laws or the statutory laws are derivative in nature. There's another difference also between the two. The statutory laws can be easily changed, whereas a constitutional law requires a very difficult procedure of amendment. It is very tough to bring about a change as far as a constitutional law is concerned. Coming to the next important point covered under the meaning of the Constitution is what are the core principles that a constitution should be reflecting upon. Different constitutions reflect upon different principles depending upon the type of government. For example, the Indian Constitution, being democratic in nature, focuses on certain principles like democratic republic, sovereignty, secularism, parliamentary government, federal state, fundamental rights, directive principles of state policy, etc. Let us now go ahead and see why do we need a constitution. What is the requirement that a constitution should be there for any state to be governed? Under this, our focus is on the important functions that a constitution needs to carry out. The first and the foremost function of a constitution is to provide a set of basic rules which allow minimal coordination and assurance amongst the members of the society. So what is that minimal coordination? It means that in a society, in a country, people from diverse backgrounds, they coexist. For example, there will be people following different religions, speaking different languages, having different cultural background, their traditions will be different, yet they need to coexist in a society. The Constitution gives us an idea how people can coexist. They can coexist when there are certain rules which are clearly written and are applicable equally for all the members of the society. The members of the country or society, they should know those rules. It is very important that they know the rules through which they are governed, because that will give them assurance that they are equally applicable to all the members of the society. Not only it is important to know the rules which are written down in the Constitution, but also very important is that they should be enforced or implemented. If people feel that they have been implemented or enforced in a justified manner, no individual have any reason to defy the Constitution. The authority of the Constitution has to be clearly demarcated. When we say authority has to be demarcated, we should clearly know who has the power to make decisions. The decision-making power belongs to the individual who holds authority. For example, in a monarchical form of a government, the power belongs to the monarch, the king, whereas in authoritarian government, a dictator will have the centralized authority to govern the country, whereas in a democratic country, the power is in the hands of the people. Since we live in an age of representative democracy, the people delegate this authority to the elected representatives who take decisions on their behalf. The other principle, which is very important to be known, is that the Constitution should provide certain limits on the powers of the government. These limits need to be fundamental in the sense that the government can never trespass them. Now, if limits are fundamental in nature, naturally we have to know that every constitution sets certain limits on the powers of the government. For example, in a society, every individual expects certain rights. We have the freedom of speech and expression, freedom not to be arrested arbitrarily, freedom to follow our religion. These are very basic freedoms or rights that every citizen in a civilized society is expected to enjoy. So whatever may be the kind of government, there is a need to set the limit on the powers of the authority. In a representative democracy, the Constitution, if it is representing the will of the people, will certainly have a cluster of rights which will clearly suggest what laws can the government make and what laws it cannot make. For example, the Constitution of India, which gives fundamental rights to the people under Part 3 of the Constitution, Article 13 clearly specifies that no such law can be made by the government which violates the fundamental rights of the people. So what are these limits? How do they come from? They come from the rights which are given to people under the fundamental constitution, and it sets certain kind of restraints on the authority of the government so that the people are able to enjoy their rights in a civilized manner and the government remains under the check all the time. The next function that a constitution is expected to follow or give is related to fulfilling the aspirations of a society. We, as members of society, have certain values, goals we cherish, we want to uphold. In fact, when we talk about these cherished values and goals, they reflect upon certain fundamental moral values which a society is expected to provide to its citizen. They get legally enforced if they are given in the Constitution. How about the principles of liberty, equality, justice, which are given in almost all the democratic constitutions in the world, including India? Are they not those aspirations which have been fulfilled by the Constitution itself, giving assurance to the people that the Constitution is based on certain basic principles, certain substantive provisions related to making the life of the people much more valuable when these principles are upheld in the Constitution and protected by the state. Coming to the last function of the Constitution is that it should provide a fundamental identity to a person. Now, living in a society, what kind of fundamental identity are we speaking about? Generally speaking, the Constitution provides three kinds of identities to the people, which we can cover under the heading political identity, moral identity, and national identity. So, what is political identity? Being members of a state, the rights that we get, the duties that we perform, the way the country is governed, it is all about providing the political identity to the people, whereas moral identity is something personal in nature. The fact is that the foundations of personal identity are clearly related to the set of basic rules which are given in the Constitution. The moral identity which we just spoke about under the concept of justice is related to what values as an individual we cherish. We may cherish the moral principles of liberty, equality, justice, in which the Constitution is very clearly correlating the identity of the people. It is also an obligation in a way on the part of the people, what is right, what is wrong, what one should do, what one should not do. So that is a personal choice, but then given a freedom or choice, we have to uphold those moral principles which give us a very important, unique identity of a society under which we live. Lastly, the fundamental right, the fundamental identity of an individual is also related to his national identity. For example, a country may have diverse, say, traditions, cultures, ethnicities, but then if the people living in a country with so many diversities and different backgrounds, if they all are tied to a constitution which provides them one single identity, it ensures that they are united despite the existing diversities in the country. The example of Indian constitution is very clear. India is a country of diversities. People with different backgrounds, they coexist, they live peacefully, and this is possible because we all have one single identity, that is, we all are Indian citizens. However, it is not that every constitution has the same kind of national identity. Some countries, like in Germany, the German ethnicity is a basic foundation for providing them with their national identity. Depending upon the constitution and the background under which people live, their national identity is determined. The next important thing that we are going to talk about is about the legitimacy of a constitution. Now, there are certain principles which a constitution needs to fulfill in order to make it a valid constitution, an acceptable constitution, a legitimate constitution. So how to ensure that the constitution fulfills its purpose? It fulfills the purpose by looking into the mode of promulgation, by providing substantive provisions, and lastly, the design of the constitution has to be done in an intelligent manner so that there is balanced institutional setup in a country. Now we'll come into the mode of promulgation, which means how a constitution came into being. A constitution will remain defunct if the person who makes the constitution is unrepresentative of the will of the people. For example, a military dictator, if he makes the constitution, naturally it will not fulfill the purpose of working for the welfare of the people. So the constitution in a way is unacceptable and invalid document. The same cannot be applied to the constitution which are made by the representatives of the people who are credible leaders and enjoy the support of the people. Indian constitution and the South African Constitution, they were framed in the background of the nationalist movement, which was carried forward by their popular leaders who enjoyed immense popular support. So those constitutions which are made by credible leaders who have the authority of the people, who are representative of the will of the people, those constitutions definitely tell us about the fact that they are valuable, they are reflecting on the will of the society, they are carrying forward the substantive provisions which a constitution should aspire for, and above all, they are not promoting their selfish interests. Rather, the mode of promulgation suggests that they are actually working on the fact that people are more important, the nation is more important than their selfish interests. So much depends upon the making of the constitution, the process through which it is made, and whether the promulgation of the constitution was made keeping in mind the opinion of the people rather than the selfish interest of the ruling authority. The next principle, which further decides the parameter which is related to the acceptability and legitimacy of the Constitution, is something which we call substantive provisions. So what are substantive provisions? They are the hallmark features which gives a reason to everyone to go by the Constitution, to follow the Constitution. They are those principles which are aimed at promoting a sense of equality, justice, and freedom in society. How can people obey a constitution which provides certain privileges to a particular section of society and deprives the other? How can a constitution allow practice of discrimination? Any constitution which is based on these unjustified principles or provisions certainly will not find acceptability. So substantive provisions is all about taking the members of the society along, and it is only when it is ensured to them that every individual is equal, that they will be given equal rights, there will be no discrimination, and that they will have every reason to show their faith in the Constitution, which is the basis of any good legitimate constitution. The third parameter for a good constitution is balanced institutional design. So, what is balanced institutional design? Balanced institutional design means there should be intelligent division of powers at two levels, horizontal and vertical. When we talk about horizontal division of powers, we are actually talking about the division of powers amongst the three organs of the government: legislature, executive, and judiciary. A good constitution will demarcate the authority of these three organs of the government so that they are able to carry out their role in an efficient manner, also providing checks and balance to provide mutual check. However, horizontal division of powers is not enough for an intelligent constitutional design. At the same time, there needs to be vertical division of powers. So, vertical division of powers can be provided in a manner which we find especially in a federal setup where there is division of powers amongst different levels. At the top is the central government powers, under that is the state government powers, and lastly, at the grassroots level, there will be local government which will enjoy its own powers. So, if any constitution is able to provide the balance of institution at horizontal and vertical level, it is somewhat considered to be a good constitution because it avoids centralization of powers and misuse of power. There also needs to be a balance between rigidity and flexibility of the Constitution. What is flexibility? It means it can be easily amended. Rigidity means a constitution is fixed in nature, it is static, it cannot be easily changed. For example, Indian Constitution, which is considered to be a blend of flexibility and rigidity, however, is less rigid than the US Constitution, which has more rigid principles and the amendments in the US Constitution cannot be as easily carried out as in Indian Constitution. So balanced institutional design is a way forward which provides a basic parameter for fulfilling essential features for the successful constitution or a legitimate constitution. Now that we have covered the three important parameters for a legitimate document, that is the Constitution, my focus will now shift to our original theme, the Indian Constitution. We will be observing whether we have been able to fulfill those important principles or the parameters to declare Indian Constitution a valid document or a legitimate document. In this context, I will be trying to explain you certain important dates in the process of making of the Indian Constitution. There may be too many dates and you need not worry. Please do not be scared because you are not expected to learn all the dates. The focused dates only need to be remembered. These are 9th December 1946, 26th November 1949 and 26th January 1950. So, as I told you, we need to know the dates because it is important to know the timeline, which helps us to bring about a connectivity. As a teacher, I need to explain you or rather tell you in brief about the significance of these dates. However, as I told you, once again, I'm emphasizing learn only those three important dates which I've just covered. The first and the foremost date. Sorry for the pause. I have a cold, so just excuse me for that. The first and the foremost date which is important is 24th July 1935. The significance of the date lies in the fact that the Government of India Act was passed by the British government and the Indian Constitution adopted many of the features from this particular document which still remains with us. The second important date is 24th March 1946. The date is important because the Cabinet Mission Plan was enforced, which emphasized upon the structure of the Constituent Assembly, particularly how the members will be elected from the princely states as well as from the states which were under British India. The next date is very, very significant. Do remember, it is 9th December 1946. The reason why it is an important date is because the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly was held, and it was held under undivided India. That is why my focus is on this date, because later on, when India was partitioned, the number of members, which originally was 389, was reduced to 299. So 9th December is an important date in the process of making of Constitution for undivided India. The next date is 22nd January 1947. The significance of the date lies in the fact that Jawaharlal Nehru introduced Objectives Resolution in the Constituent Assembly. Objective Resolution is related to those values or aspirations and ideals which have been enshrined in the preamble to the Indian Constitution. It reflects those substantive provisions which I told you in the previous lecture, which I had told you earlier. It is about those moral values which we aspire as citizens of a democratic country. Principles like liberty, equality, justice, fraternity, they all formed an important part of the Objectives Resolution. It won't be wrong to say that preamble is a replica of Objectives Resolution. Coming to the next date, it is 3rd June 1947. So this date is significant in the sense that Mountbatten Plan was put into force. The significance lies in the fact that the plan for partition of the country was given official approval, and thus the partition of India happened, and the next meetings of the General Assembly were for divided India, that is, those territories which were under the Indian Union with reduced number of members of the Constituent Assembly. The next date, as we move on, is 14th August 1947. This is important again with the view that the first meeting of the Constituent Assembly was held for divided India. So if you compare, the first meeting for undivided India was held on 9th December 1946, whereas the first meeting of Constituent Assembly for divided India was held on 14th August 1947. The next date, which is again quite significant, is 26th November 1949. It is important to remember this date, 26th November 1949. We all celebrate Constitution Day every year. So it is obvious it has to relate with the adoption of the Indian Constitution. The Constitution of India was completed. It was enacted on this particular date, 26th November 1949. However, it was not enforced on the same date. For that, we have to study the last important date, that is 26 January 1950. Now, this date, as we all know, is very important because we celebrate our Republic Day on 26th January every year. It is on this date in the year 1950 that the Constitution was put into force and we were able to have our own Constitution for sovereign India, and accordingly we govern our country in accordance with the Constitution enforced on 26th January 1950.